Quinlan as our presenter. And I will tell you a little bit about Wednesday Forum first. So Wednesday Forum is held by two institutions, the ICRS and CRCS. ICRS is Indonesian Consortium for Religious Studies. It is for the doctoral program. And the CRCS is the Center for Religious and Cross-Cultural Studies at the Graduate School, University of Gadjah Mada. And for today's Wednesday Forum, it will be we will have the topic of crossing geographic and religious borders, Muslim migrants on Sumba and Timor Islands. And our presenter will be Dr. Mike Quinlan. He is a Christian pastor serving with the Yogyakarta International Congregation and alumnus of ICRS. So motivated by his own religious communities failing to understand the experiences of migrants to the US, he and his family migrated to Indonesia to experience firsthand the life of migrants to become one of the religious minority. So in this forum, he will talk about the phenomenon of migration and the changes that occur in Muslim migrants' faith and practice as they move from their Muslim majority homelands to the Christian majority islands of Sumba and Timor. In this presentation, he stated that migration disrupts the religious and cultural patterns of migrants, leading to social and religious adaptations. Migrants mitigate the loss of ethnic and religious bonds through changes in personal habits, participation in religious communities, and through ethnic enclaving. Many participants report that their experience as migrants produce positive changes in their personal religious belief. So, Dr. Quinlan, you will have 40 to 45 minutes presentation and 40 to 45 minutes later to have question and answers. And for the participants, in this question and answers, you can raise hand virtually if you have questions, or write in the chat box your questions. So for now, Dr. Quinlan, please, the time is yours.
Thank you, Dita. Well, good afternoon to all. For those of you joining elsewhere in the world, good morning and good evening. Here in Texas, it is 1 a.m. And so it is almost time to hear the calls of sahur if we were in Indonesia. And so to all those celebrating Ramadan this month, I just want to say Ramadan Mubarak to you. I feel you. I feel your tiredness even now as I'm awake in the middle of the night. And I pray a blessed Ramadan upon all of you. And as I've shared with many people recently, that even though I'm a Christian, I miss the celebrations of Ramadan. I miss the decorations in the malls, and I miss the iftar dinners with my friends in Indonesia. And so as we're thinking about migrants, Muslim migrants to NTT today, I'm reminded of the many interviews in which I sat with Muslim migrants, and they reflected about missing and just how much they missed, and became very emotional thinking about Ramadan, thinking about Lebaran, far away from their home islands. And so I just encourage you to, if you have friends in NTT, to reach out to them. If you have friends living elsewhere around the world, to reach out to them to wish them happy Ramadan, and maybe send them some bakpia. Let them know that they are missed too. So my story begins with my story in the US. This research is very much motivated by my personal desire to learn more. I grew up in a small suburb of a larger city, and when I first moved to this city, the town was still mostly a farming community. Mostly it was white, and mostly it was rural. but it was developing and modernizing quickly. At one point in the 1990s, my town was one of the top 3 fastest growing cities in the US. And this growth brought newcomers from across the US and from around the world. No longer was my city ethnically or religiously homogenous. Now, the US has had several waves of mass immigration throughout its history. Early on, most immigrants were Northern European and Protestant. Later, Europeans of Italian and Irish descent, such as my family, arrived, and they drew suspicion on account of their Catholic faith. Still, until the 20th century, migration to the United States was largely European and mostly Christian. And in 1965, much of that changed with the revision of immigration laws. And the subsequent wave of Asian immigrants to the US brought changes to many cities, including my small town. In my city, immigrants from South Asia have replaced Hispanics as the largest immigrant group. Now, these immigrants are Hindu, they're Muslim, and they're Buddhist. And when I moved to Indonesia in 2014, my postal code had become more than 50% immigrant, with 1 in 3 of every person living in my town or my postal code having been born outside the US. Now, when I was young, people with non-Western names who went to the mosque or to the temple instead of a church were among my closest friends. Every day we inhabited the same places, the same schools, playgrounds, offices, and neighborhoods. And while everything seemed peaceful to me as a child, when I grew up and took a position as a religious leader, I began to discern the tensions within my community. What concerned me most of all was how the Christian church was dealing with the issue of immigration. Mostly failing, mostly responding in fear and suspicion. And that's what led me to Indonesia. If I was sitting on the 4th floor of SPS right now, I could look out at the participants' faces of this Wednesday forum. And I could see the effects of migration in the clothes that you wear, your facial features, skin tones, religious dress, and ornamentation. I could probably hear it in the accents as you speak. I could likely get a sense of who was fasting and who was not. I'd probably see the Christian who forgot that it was Ramadan and brought their water bottle into the forum, only to be shamed into keeping it hidden. Now, migration has shaped the genetics of the Indonesian archipelago, but also its spirituality. The world's religions have supplanted or mixed with local beliefs these last 2,000 years of Indonesia's history, as migrants from China, India, the Middle East, and Europe migrated to, traded with, or colonized this nation. And so within this same country, you have places like Aceh, Bali, and Papua with radically different religious demographics. But migration isn't something that shaped this country in the past. It's something that continues to reshape Indonesia even now as people move from desa to kota, from Indonesia's outer islands to Java, from all over the world to Jakarta and to Bali. And so today in places like Jogja, you can find a 1,300-year-old Hindu temple across the street from a mosque. You can find a Catholic church built in Javanese style, and a group of people from around the world and from many different faiths joining this forum to learn from one another. And just like my community in the US, wherein lies growing tensions between migrants and their host communities, we find similar struggles in Indonesia. Now, as I study the interreligious conflicts of Indonesia's recent past, a common trend arose. Many scholars of these conflicts commented to the demographic shifts in religion due to migration as a root cause of these conflicts. Now, a quick survey of recent and ongoing conflicts reveals the struggles of communities as once seemingly firm and strict geographic and religious boundaries are eroded with the movements of people. This is evident in the houses of worship controversies across Indonesia, where religious buildings are rejected by locals because this or that geographic space has been claimed for a particular religious group. And so Bataks have difficulties building in Bekasi, the Balinese in Bogor, and the Bimanese in NTT. In Indonesia's conflict studies, migration is often one of the stated causes, but most of the commentary has to do with the immediate actions and reactions of the community and says very little of the migrant or host community's experience leading up to the conflict. So I started looking for migration studies in Indonesia. The available literature largely dealt with urbanization or Indonesian migrant workers going abroad. There was little that spoke of internal migrants and their stories. With this gap, I set out to listen to migrants, to discern if and how migration was affecting them, their beliefs, and their religious practices. Wanting to better understand the experiences of Muslim migrants to the US, I determined to focus on Muslim migrants to Christian regions of Indonesia. And I settled on the region of NTT, and specifically the islands of Sumba and Timor. Now, migration and religion are both very large concepts, and thus I took a phenomenological approach to this study, primarily wanting to study the interplay between the two, religion and migration. My research questions follow the bolded themes, looking at migrants' motivation, adaptation, and what, if any, changes occur in the beliefs, practices, institutions, and perceptions of Christians of the migrants themselves. I developed this ethnographic framework by looking at research on migrants within the American context. Though not a comparative study, I used the trends seen in migrant religion in America to help me frame the study and suggest both avenues of inquiry and potential hypotheses. Now, I initially planned to conduct this research in Papua. And so if anyone's hankering to do research in Papua, this is definitely recommended for further study. In Papua, the migrant populations are larger and the inter-religious conflict is more recent, if not ongoing. But early on, my advisors instructed me, due to the concerns for my safety, that I should look elsewhere. And so I started looking at other places in Indonesia, and that's where I was led to NTT, to specifically look at how Muslim migrants from Muslim majority islands move and enter Christian majority islands. Sumba and Timor were chosen due to the existence of relatively recent Muslim migrant communities when compared to Flores, which has ancient Muslim communities and tribes living on the island. On both islands, I sought out urban and rural locations, and I'll explain more in subsequent slides. And I began this study with hopes of surveying hundreds of migrants, if not more. My early tests revealed that surveying would be inadequate for my needs. The issue of religion was simply too sensitive, and as an outsider, people were closed off to my questioning. Finding participants proved difficult in the beginning, as migrants were weary of being interviewed, and several leaders within the Islamic community proved unhelpful in recruiting willing participants. So after countless canceled interview appointments, I adjusted my approach, and the research began picking up speed. Instead of surveys and focus group discussions, I turned to personal interviews with one or two people. By word of mouth and referral, I gained access to more people in the community and was able to be more purposive in my sampling. As you can see from the slide, I tried to include a broad swath of the migrant population in terms of location, gender, origin, and migration period. In terms of migration period, the numbers for each decade loosely follow migration patterns. More migrants having arrived in the last 2 decades than in the latter decades of the 20th century. Now, if you have Instagram, you likely know of Sumba Island. Its traditional houses and culture have recently drawn large number of tourists, and many believe Sumba could be the next Bali. It could be the next tourism hotspot. The island, along with NTT as a whole, however, is underdeveloped and one of the poorest areas of Indonesia. Except for a few urban centers, the island is largely lacking in infrastructure and faces issues of food scarcity, health, and drought. Last week, both Sumba and West Timor were hit by extreme weather and resulting in flooding and damage to an already weakened crop season. Now, until the last century, Sumba was ruled by tribal kings. Though the Bimini Sultanate and later the Dutch claimed Sumba as part of their territory, there was little interaction with the island beyond trade. Known alternatively as Sandalwood Island, the island's main exports were timber and slaves. With the exception of a few protected forested areas, the island has largely been deforested. And so the pictures you see on Instagram of rolling savannas belie what Sumba once was, a forested island full of sandalwood. Bimanis, Bugis, Indonesian, and Arab traders have had small settlements on Sumba's northern coast for centuries, but neither Islam nor Christianity made its way inland until the 20th century. This was made possible by the Dutch's pacification of the tribal kings at the turn of the 20th century. Unlike other areas of Indonesia where the Dutch limited Christianizing activity, the Dutch allowed the Protestant church on Sumba and in Timor to freely work in the region. And they did so because they were actively trying to limit the expansion of Islam. Slowly, the island's traditional religions, Marapu, has been replaced and mixed with Christian and Catholic belief systems. Still, there are many areas which remain Marapu, and the growing recognition of Indonesia's indigenous religions may see a revival of Marapu in the near future. Islam largely remains located on the coast, port cities of Waikelo, Mamboro, and Wangapu. But in the 1900s, it too made inroads into the central portions of Sumba. Arab traders intermarried with locals, and people of Arab descent can still be seen walking around the streets of Waikabubak. Though there are Sumbanese Muslims, the Muslim community remains a predominantly migrant community, most having arrived in recent decades. There's one main road, Jalan Negara, which travels west to east across Sumba, and it takes around 3 to 4 hours at present to go from Tambalaka to Wangapu. My 2 research locations were situated on this road, not only for ease of access, but because most of the migrant population lives and works along this road. I chose Waikabubak to represent my urban location and the village of Anakalang as my rural location. Though 20 kilometers apart, the experience of migrant communities is quite different in these locations. Waikabubak has the benefit of several nearby mosques, Islamic schooling, and pesantren. Waikabubak's Muslim population is nearly 15%, while Anakalang is only 7%. Both of these areas are heavily Christianized, with relatively few remaining Marapu adherents. Most of Marapu adherents are concentrated in the Regency of East Sumba. Across NTT, the Muslim population has largely remained the same, around 9 to 10% since the latter 20th century. There's a sizable increase in the Muslim population due to continued migration and starting of families, but this is matched by birth rates, high birth rates of the local residents. And so you don't see large shifts in demographics that you might see elsewhere. West Timor, like Sumba, is underdeveloped and poverty-stricken. The development levels of each of the 8 regencies is below the Indonesian average, with the exception of Kota Kupang. For this reason, Kupang stands out among my research locations. Its population and development state provide opportunities that you just can't find in other research areas in NTT. Kupang has been an important trading port for hundreds of years, and the Western powers of the Dutch and Portuguese fought over control of Timor. And this eventually resulted in the division of the land. The competition between these Western powers influenced Timor religion as well, as the Dutch promoted Protestantism and the Portuguese Catholicism. Today, while the Indonesian portion of the island is majority Protestant, Timor-Leste and bordering Kabupaten in Timor Barat are majority Catholic. Like in Sumba, Islam in Timor largely remained a coastal phenomenon. The faith of traders, the few settlers that settled in the port areas. And as in Sumba, the growth and spread of Islam and Christianity on the island is recent to the 20th century. Christianity spread with the help of Christian education offered by the Dutch, and later a revival movement in the 60s and 70s. Outside of Kupang, there do exist Muslim migrant communities, as well as several local Timorese enclaves of Muslims. The sites chosen for Timor include the city of Kupang, the village of Baun, about 45 minutes from Kupang, and Oekam, about 3 hours from Kupang. Baun is a small town with a handful of migrant businesses which surround the Pasar area. There is a mix of Bimanese and Bugis migrants there, the Bimanese working as PNS and the Bugis as traders. Baun is surrounded by villages with no Muslim populations due to local kings maintaining land rights into the late 20th century. Most of these local kings did not want Muslims to settle there, with the exception of the king of Baun, who had a Muslim friend and thus allowed Muslims to live in his area, and hence, until today, a small population of Muslims exists in this region. Oekam is also unique in its relationship to the local kings. One of the local kings converted to Islam. His tribe followed him. In Oekam and surrounding villages, there are therefore native Timorese Muslims. A small road leads through the middle of the village, and shops line this road. The shops run by Bugis migrants. Kupang, as I said earlier, stands out from other locations due to its size. The large Muslim population provides access to many more Muslim institutions, including mosques, schools, and Muhammadiyah University. It provides opportunities for socialization and diversification of Muslim social groups simply due to its size, something we don't see outside of potentially in Wake Ubak, but something that can't be replicated in the rural areas due to the small size of these communities. Like in Sumba, the Muslim population of Timor has grown in the last decade, but not to a significant degree. Less than 1% here is projected and changed from 2007 to 2017. But I must note that this research was conducted prior to the 2020 census, and therefore these figures do need to be updated. But suffice it to say, we don't see rapid increases in migration like we would see elsewhere in Papua and West Papua. One of the Wednesday's forums from a few weeks back talked about the stories of Muslim women travel writers. Now, many of us likely have fantastical tales of our travels and finding ourselves in a foreign land, even if that's just simply on the other side of the city. If there are oral historians listening today, I'd highly recommend capturing the stories of these immigrants. They are wonderful snapshots into the history and development of these places. This portion of my interviews proved the most entertaining, informative, and emotional. And while some of my participants found it hard to answer questions about their belief and practice, all had a vivid story of their travel to NTT. My favorite is of a man who had a vision that Allah was calling him to the east. And so at 19, he stowed away on a boat and landed in Timor and has lived there ever since. He lived in Timor for 5 years before his parents even knew he was alive. The stories of migration always began with the need to leave, why it was important to move from their sending society to Sumba or Timor. Most migrants struggled before they left for many years trying to find work, trying to find profit, a successful career before finally making the decision to move. Economic competition, job scarcity, and even corruption were commonly the reasons that staying in their homes was no longer acceptable. And so they decided to migrate. These decisions were helped by developing or developed migrant networks and systems where others had migrated to Sumba and Timor and sent word back to their sending societies of the successes that they had had. And bolstered by these stories of success or the invitations from families and friends, the migrants set out to try their luck in the wild, wild east of NTT. Until today, the primary mode of transportation to NTT is boat travel. Few migrants, save for NGO and workers and PNS, had the means to take an airplane trip the first time out. Most came with only what they could carry on their person. Many walked on and off the boat, only buying a motorbike in the last decade. NTT's migrants largely come from Java, Entebbe, and South Sulawesi. This means an 8-hour boat ride at the minimum if coming from Sumbawa, to several days, if not a week, traveling from Java. The common refrain when asked about their arrival to Sumba and Timor is that the migrants were setengah mati, half dead, and kaget, shocked. Some walked off the boat with no clue about the island to which they were arriving, its traditions, its language or culture. Some had no clue where to go or when they arrived. One Beninese migrant told me that after he arrived from a stormy night's voyage across the sea to Sumba, he walked around until he found someone wearing a veil. He knew she would be Muslim, and he asked her if his family could stay with them for the night, as they had no place to sleep, nowhere to go, and no motorbike to take him anywhere else. The shock of arriving migrants largely circled around 4 things: pigs, dogs, alcohol in Timor, and swords in Sumba. Unlike their new Muslim majority homes, unlike their former Muslim majority homes, dogs and pigs ran freely in the streets and in the marketplace. In Timor, until recently, public drunkenness was endemic. And until today, many Sumbanese will wear swords on their hips, scaring new migrants, but used only for agriculture. Unlike one study I utilized, which observed migrants seeking spiritual support and instruction as it concerns migration, participants' faith played very little role in the initial stages of migration. Only a few migrants mentioned praying about their migration or seeking spiritual support in advance. 2 on Timor moved due to religious motivations. One, as I mentioned, due to the vision, the other to serve as a missionary in East Timor. As we'll see in later slides, the experience of migrants has been significant from the perspective of religion, but few spoke of their journeys in religious terms. Only a handful made explicit connections between their migrations and their Muslim faith. One, for instance, said, like the Prophet, he left Mecca because it was not comfortable. It's the same for me in Bima. Life was hard there. Here it is easy. Others may have said Allah ordained it, or Allah gave me a better life here in NTT. One of my favorite responses when asked if Faith played a role in his decision to move was when a migrant said no. It was all about profit. And this holds true as moving for economic reasons is the primary motivation of migrants in my study. And one reason for asking the question as to why migrants make the decision to move is because of the concern that migration is often equated with Islamization, or in other areas, Christianization. In studies of transmigration, for instance, it is a recurrent theme and critique that the government program places transmigrants in certain areas to Javanize or Islamicize the region. As might be expected, Islamization is not a primary motivation for the migrants in my study. These migrants are largely self-funded, spontaneous migrants, and there's no sense of large-scale coordination between migrant communities for the purposes of Islamizing NTT. Only one of my participants out of 108 moved for the purposes of dakwah, working as a missionary to Timor-Leste and then to West Timor. Others may have mentioned its presence in the area, but most acknowledged that dakwah is primarily performed internal to the community. The vast majority of migrations occurred as people were looking for work and profit for their businesses. But basic economic theories of migration really don't fit what we see in Sumba and Timor. The economic disparities between the islands don't match the basic economic theories. There is no sense of moving from an underdeveloped area to a more developed area. There's no sense of unskilled workers moving to a place in need of cheap labor. Instead, these are largely skilled workers, tradesmen moving to an underdeveloped area where the hope for income, the hope for a career is rolling the dice. It's a gamble. What we see mostly, how we see mostly this migration connecting to migration theory is through migrant networks and systems. Migrant networks are built off the successes of previous migrants. They share these successes back to their communities, and that drives further migration. That drives and supports the chain migration that we see continuing on until today. Now imagine for a moment you were coming to Texas to visit me. You'd be forced to speak English, as I'm probably one of 4 people in this city that speaks Indonesian, the other 3 being my family members. You'd have a hard time finding a mosque. You have a much harder time finding a temple. Where would you eat? You'd have to adapt pretty quickly or starve. Now, although the migrants from this study are only moving within Indonesia, the change in context can be extreme as they cross the borders from their homelands into NTT. There are different languages, cultures, and religion at play. Presently, each of the locations has a mosque, but the ability to hear the call to prayer is diminished or non-existent, and the access to the mosque is lessened due to distance when compared with their former homes. Now, migrants have adapted to this by using mobile applications or setting alarms to remind them of the call to prayer, or simply by praying on the hour. Instead of going to the mosque at every call to prayer, they pray in the home or they pray in their office. This is unlike the traditions or the habits of many Bimanese and Bugis migrants who said that they went to the mosque or the mushala at every time of prayer because the community expected it of them, because the community was inviting them, because if they were lazy to go to the mosque, somebody was there to take their hand and bring them to prayer. Now, the migrants related varied experiences as it regards adaptation, affected by the factors including ethnicity, gender, location, and arrival period. Earlier migrants, women, and those living in rural areas had the most difficult transitions. Now, though these are generalizations, the Javanese tend to reside in urban environments, while the Bimanese and the Bugis are more comfortable in urban areas, in rural areas. For this reason, the Javanese tend to adapt to the local culture less so compared to the Bimanese and the Bugis. The Bimanese and the Bugis, on the basis of them living far from the city, living amongst people who may or may not speak Bahasa Indonesia, are forced to learn the local languages and adapt to local customs much more so than Javanese in the city who may simply live in an enclave. I spoke to one woman who had been in Sumba for 20 years, but she lived in an enclave of thousands of Javanese and had no Sumbanese friends even after 20 years. Female migrants noted that their husbands or other migrant men had deeper levels of acculturation as they more freely interacted with locals, as the females had responsibilities in the home or were less free to engage the community besides maybe the weekly pasar trip. But the biggest discrepancy in migrants' perceptions of adaptation to the environment of Sumba and Timor was the arrival period. Migrants arriving in the 60s, 70s, and 80s had a much more difficult transition. They were more likely to live among Sumbanese or Timorese, and though the transition was difficult, they perceived their adaptation to entité to be much deeper, having adopted local cultures and a language to an extent that most new migrants never will. More recent migrants, they contend, have an easier transition due to developmental states of the islands, technology, and a larger Muslim community. But this largely keeps them from acculturating. Instead, they might live, work, and interact with only other Muslims, and possibly only with those from their ethnic group. And one of the most important adaptive strategies I found amongst the migrants was creating space for worship and their dietary needs among the Christian community by advancing religious literacy, whether it be informal or formal opportunities to share with their neighbors, to share with their classmates and colleagues about the needs and the requirements of their faith. Knowledge of Islam has grown over time in Entité, and especially in the cities where Muslim-Christian interactions are more frequent. But rural villages are largely still ignorant of Islamic customs. As we come to the changes in belief, disruption, of course, is the first one. And it's an inevitable outcome of the change in context as migrants reorient themselves to the demands of daily life. Many couldn't find work, they couldn't find housing, they didn't know where to eat, they didn't know where to pray. Some migrants, this was temporary, and some it was long-lasting and permanent. There are some migrants I spoke to that have not been to the mosque in the years since they moved. Some simply because they lost the habit, others because they live too far from the mosque. We also see trends of individuation and individualization as people leave the mosque in preference of worship in the home. Again, because the mosque is too far, or simply because they've lost the habit or they're not being invited by the community. Perhaps in Bima, perhaps in South Sulawesi, they were forced to go to the mosque, or they were pressured, or they were invited. Maybe they didn't have a personal habit of prayer, but because the community expected it of them, that's what they did. Others, they went through processes of individuation in which, for the first time in their life, they acknowledged their identity as Muslims. Before, in their Muslim majority environments, they were just one of many. And now, as they moved into Sumba, as they encountered a Christian majority, they realized that they were different and the things that they believed were different. And they could choose, free from the pressures of Muslim majority society, how that they would express their Islam through their belief. And for a majority of participants in the study, this resulted in an increase in their faith or an enhancement of their faith. They saw that even though perhaps their practice in the mosque had decreased, they found Islam to be more personal and private to them, resulting in a belief that they chose for themselves rather than something families chose for them. And whereas many Asian immigrants to the US become more conservative in their belief, I found that amongst these migrants, they were more progressive. They were more open and inclusive when compared to people coming from different faith traditions, whether it's Christianity or even different Islamic traditions within the Muslim faith. Now, when we come to conversion, of course, is a concern. It's a concern of migrants, and it's also a concern of the host communities. But conversions, while they do occur, are quite rare in the context of Sumba and Timor. And when they happen, it's usually because of intermarriage. It's Muslim migrants marrying Sumbinese women, or it's Sumbinese Christians marrying Muslim migrant women. And so it's exceedingly rare, but it does happen. And we're not seeing rapid Islamization. We're not seeing rapid Christianization of the migrants. And so it's something we need not be too concerned with. Now, when we come to institutions, when we come to how has migration or living in the context of NTT as Muslim minorities, how has that changed the religious institutions? We see some expected results. Those are that there are deficiencies in the mosque in NTT when compared to the sending societies. Namely, that there are fewer mosques. They have poorer facilities and less qualified leadership. But some of the things that migrants really liked about their mosque was the diversity that they found in Sumba, for instance. In Sumba, you have 3 mosques in Wekububak. You have 1 mosque in Anakalang. And because you have a smaller number of mosques, everyone from whatever ethnic tradition or ethnic background or whatever stream of Islam, they join together for worship. And so it opens them up to new ideas. It opens them up to kind of a sense of forced tolerance. They have to come together and put away their differences. And because of this, some of the migrants appreciated their experience living as minorities in NTT. Now, in the case of Bound, for instance, the diversity worked against them. You had power struggles between the Bimanese, for instance, and the Javanese, or the Bimanese and the Bugis, and that caused a divide. And so now you have the Bimanese, which are continuing to attend the mosque, but the Bugis feel isolated and ostracized, and so they are no longer part of the mosque. In Oekam, you have a migrant mosque and you have a local Timorese mosque. And so the patterns change depending on where you are. But what's interesting in Kupang and the urban environments, you have more opportunity for diversity, for diversification among these mosques. You can have, because of the population of Muslims in Kupang, you can have a Javanese mosque, you can have an NU mosque, you can have a Muhammadiyah mosque, you can have an LDE mosque, you can have an Ahmadiyya mosque, something you may not be able to have if you're living in a rural location. And other Muslim activities, social activities, Pengajian and Arizan, they largely follow the same patterns as the mosque. In urban environments, you can have more opportunity to diversify your meeting group along ethnic lines, along religious lines, along origins and things like this. And so, whereas in Anakalang, for instance, you have maybe one Pengajian group from your enclave. In Wekububak, you have a Javanese Pengajian group, you have a mixed Pengajian group, you have a Bimanese Pengajian group. And of course, in Kupang, there'll be endless groups of Pengajian groups, even down to the sub-tribe. For instance, the East Javanese have different Pengajian groups for each sub-tribe of East Javanese. And then after mosque, the next thing to come is religious education. And it's available in 3 of the 5 contexts. But migrants are split between their preference for public or religious offerings. The costs and the quality of the school is a consideration. And this blends over to enclaves. Enclaves become more of a possibility as the community grows. Earlier migrants, of course, didn't have that opportunity to necessarily live amongst other ethnic peers. So they had to live with the local Sudanese, they had to live with the local Timorese, and they tend to stay that way even now. Newer migrants tend to clump together. All that to say, let's get to the perceptions of migrants regarding Christians. They more data is needed here. I'll be honest with that. More data is needed here. It was hard for the migrants to give me a sense of their belief of Christians prior to their migration. Almost all of them had positive perceptions of Christians post-migration. They all felt welcome. They felt received by the community. Something like 98% of the respondents believed NTT to be more tolerant than their sending societies. But while they would say that maybe their sending societies were discriminatory against Christians or other religious minorities, it was hard for them to say that they had those beliefs. And so there definitely needs to be a follow-up here. Interreligious conflict is not really an issue. There's been small, minor things recently in the last decades, issues with mosque building, rejection, which have been managed by the state or local groups. But 1998 is the biggest thing that's happened in Kupang, the riots, the anti-Muslim riots. And both migrants and the locals there said, you know, this was an aberration. It's not who Kupang is. And the migrants that were there and lived through that, they said, you know, this was something that happened, but it's not who Kupang was then, and it's not who Kupang was now. And lastly, we get to kind of my implication. So what does all this mean? What does all this mean for us? What do we take from this learning, and how do we change going forward? Well, number one, there's a great need for interreligious literacy. Migrants need to know more about Christianity and the cultures that they're going to enter. Christians receiving migrants need to know more about Islam. And so whether that's a national curriculum or whether that's through teachings and trainings offered by local government or faith-based organizations, this is something we need to work on. There needs to be religious accommodations made for migrants. One of the biggest adaptations and problems people had adapting to Sumba and Timor was that there was no place for them to pray at work or at school. And so Beninese teachers maybe had to pray on top of their desk, or they had to go into a dirty closet. Maybe employees at a government office, maybe the meetings were held on Friday, and so they missed Friday prayers, or the food that was brought in for luncheons was not halal. Accommodations need to be made for migrants. We need to put away this idea that migration is somehow linked with Islamization and Christianization. There may be demographic changes, but the idea that these migrants come with Islamization motives is unfounded in the research I've seen, and also the research that I've done. There needs to be support programs. One thing that happens often in the US is both Christian and Muslim organizations are helping receive migrants from other countries, helping them to adapt to the US. That includes NGOs, that includes government workers as well. There's nothing like that I really see in NTT, and this is something that's probably needed to help solve and prevent future conflict from happening. I'll say one thing about land rights real fast. Land rights, especially in Sumba, are becoming a big issue just among between Sudanese and other Indonesian, between Sudanese, Javanese, Balinese. Land right protections need to be, and migration policy needs to be adjudicated in Sumba and Timor to make sure that these local tribes, these indigenous communities, don't lose their land due to migrants basically buy them out of their homelands. In Weko Bubak, the lowly tribe has lost most of its land because migrants have bought it. And where they made cash quick, it's going to become a generational problem very soon. The last thing I'll say is just one of the interesting things that came out of this was, you know, there's probably an expectation that migrants move to NTT, they're farther away from the Muslim community, they're farther away from the mosque, and so they're going to lose their faith. But the opposite was true. For many, they found their faith, and they found a deeper faith. And I saw some of the same things happening at the early lockdowns of pandemic. People were no longer allowed to worship at the mosque. People were no longer allowed to worship in the church. And my faith community, a lot of people said, you know, I can't worship in the church any longer, but something about this adaptation process, something about not being able to go to church, something about not being surrounded or maybe even forced to go to church by my family or my friends or my community. I'm finding that I'm believing stronger on my own right. And so that's probably an opportunity for further study as well. I'm at time, so I will end there and I will welcome your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Quinlan. So for now, maybe we can have question and answers discussion. Okay, Bapak Zain, please. You are still on mute. You are still mute, please. Unmute.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Hi, Mike. Yeah, it's good to listen to your presentation again. Um, so I have a question. Well, probably this is not the best question from this meeting. Maybe it should not be the first question, but this is more a methodological question because I'm now we're working with a student who is doing a study on environmental migration. But anyway, um, so I was wondering, well, from your perspective as a researcher, you are a student or scholar of religious studies. You did research on Muslim migration to a majority non-Muslim region. Uh, so here you identified the migrants and the locations religiously. I mean, Muslim migrants, majority non-Muslim region. Yet in the beginning, I guess, you did not know the role of religion or how religion features in the story of their migration. And as your research shows, actually it turned out that religion does not play a big role in the migration. Well, at least not in the motivations, although there may be different story in terms of the adaptations and the institutions after the migration. But I was wondering, what were your expectations when you studied the research? How you then made adaptations while doing the research and got some initial findings about the role of religion. As I said, I'm asking this because the issue has come up in some students' research. I mean, in a more general way, is how do you, as a religious studies scholar, find religion in phenomenon which may not be easily identified as a religious phenomenon. So
Yeah.
I mentioned the example of the students I'm advising now. She's doing a research on environmental migration and trying to look at the religious narrative behind the migration, etc. So yeah, I think you got what I'm aiming at, I hope. Thank you.
Yeah. So from my background study, I've been studying migration for 10 years at this point. And so I know that migration plays a role in religion. And for some, religion plays a role in migration. I expected in my study with the prevalence of migration themes in Islam, I expected to hear more from migrants about how they connected their migration to their Muslim faith. I didn't really see much of any of that. And so methodologically, I'd say one of the helpful things for me is I did not have a strict timeline on when I needed to start and when I needed to stop this study. Well, I didn't have a strict timeline until UGM changed everything, and then I had to have a strict timeline. Before, I was thinking, if this takes me years, I will take years to make sure that this research is done correctly. And so I think it's helpful for new scholars or scholars entering into building their methodology if they allow opportunities to change and adapt and some reflexivity to engaging the context and engaging the issue. Because if I just went in with my initial plans and made no changes, this research would have blown up in my face and it would have amounted to nothing. But I was able to adapt not only my research approach, but the things I was studying. Very quickly, I learned that Muslims aren't associating religious themes to their migration stories, but migration is having an impact on their religion, on their belief, their practice. And so that helped me to kind of adjust my kind of ethnographic framework I developed. One of the things that's hard is maybe we expect, because we read all this material about how migrants assign faith themes to their migration in the broader literature. But when I got to it, it was really hard to have migrants discern the changes that they saw from moving from Entebbe to Entete. One of the really frustrating things for me, for instance, was in talking about how migration changes religious institutions. In the American context, the institutions of migrants become very privatized. They become very associational. They take on ethnic rule. They maybe leave the American church and create sub-churches based on their ethnicities. I didn't really see a lot of that in Entete, one, because of the size of the Muslim community, but also because it was hard for the migrants to articulate the changes from a mosque in Entebbe to a mosque in Sumba. And it was maddening to some extent. I, as an outsider, can look at the three mosques in Wake Bubak and say, okay, this mosque is like this mosque is like that, and this mosque, has this kind of following and this kind of religious teaching. It was hard for them to articulate that. And so having the freedom to have avenues of inquiry dead end is important to building your methodology. Having the time and the ability to adapt your methodology is important. If she's looking, or he is looking at environmental migration and trying to apply religious themes, or trying to see how environmental migrants apply religious themes, that's going to be a hard thing to find. Just as I had a hard time finding people applying religious themes to their migration. And so he's going to need to take a lot of time. And in terms of developing the questionnaire, I mean, you have to be careful not to kind of make people theologize their experiences. And that's what I feared. I didn't want people to theologize experience. So I in my questioning, I was very careful in the words and choices I used, the question I asked, because I wanted to hear their interpretations, their religious interpretations, not my imposition of them. And so she or he has his work cut out for him. And I'm happy to look at their methodology and talk with them more.
Well, thank you. I think the warning about not theologizing is very important, especially for religious studies scholars. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Pak Zainal. And other comments or questions, please, from the participants? Or maybe I want to comment on your presentation. I think your analysis about Timor and also Sumba is kind of very interesting, because as you said that the migrants adapted difficult to the local culture, and I understand that because it's kind of very different between Javanese and also Sumba or Timor. But can you kind of explain more detail what kind of difficulties they encounter when they entered the society? Because yeah, as we know that their religion is also different, but how about the culture itself?
Yeah, so kind of the stereotype of people from Sumba and Entete is that they are loud and they're cepat marah, they're quick to anger, they're very rude and they're outspoken, very different than Javanese, who are tend to be quiet. They tend to not be assertive. They tend to, rather than being direct, they're indirect. And so little differences in communication style is one of the first things that challenges these migrants. And that's even after you get past the fact that, the Bugis may be coming from South Sulawesi and have their own native language. The Bimanese have their own native language. The Javanese, the people from Lombok, all these migrants come with their own native language, and then some proficiency in Bahasa Indonesia. And then you enter into NTT, where proficiency in Bahasa Indonesia is still very low in some areas. And so that's why you have schools now offering education in local languages. And so communication, one of the simplest things that we have to do is interpersonal skills, is a challenge from the get-go. I know from being in Indonesia, learning and working and researching in a different language, even going from Bahasa Indonesia to Bahasa Indonesia, from Java to NTT, there's different vocabularies, there's different accents. And then working with all these migrants, they have different accents and vocabularies. And so it was really a challenge for me just to do research. And so, yeah, that's number one, the challenge of language. And then you have culture. Cultural expectations and the ignorance in terms of religious literacy play in together. In Sumba, for instance, it's very common to have these extravagant parties for weddings and funerals. And you would invite everyone, including your Muslim migrant friends, to join in this. Well, in Sumba, they kill buffalo for weddings and funerals, and they kill pork and goats and pigs, and everything that has meat, they kill and they eat it. Well, in Sumba, to refuse something that is offered to you is a sign of disrespect. But for many of these Muslim migrants, being offered haram foods is a sign of disrespect. And so because of their religious and cultural ignorance, they felt disrespected, and these misconceptions led to conflict, interpersonal conflict that didn't need to be there. And it would have been as simple as the Sumbanese knowing that Muslim migrants needed to cut their own meat, for instance. They needed to have a separate table. Or as simple as the Muslim migrants knowing that, hey, when you show up to this party, there's going to be alcohol, there's going to be pork. And so you either choose not to show up, or you suffer through your offense. And many have learned to adapt. Many at the beginning who could not sit with somebody eating pork or dog, they can now share a table with them. They're not going to eat haram foods, but they're going to be able to share a meal with somebody who is. And that's a challenge for some people. That's going to be a challenge differently for Javanese maybe than it is for people from Bima. The Bimanese migrants said, hey, food is number one on our list of, how we live out our, faith into the community. We cannot eat, we as Muslim men cannot even eat food that was slaughtered by Muslim women. And so that's a change and adaptation that is going to have to happen for different cultures. And so I think those are too longish answers, but I could keep going. But I think we have another question.
Thank you. And there is one question from Rumaiza Abu Bakar. Where is the Muslim migrant population mainly located in Sumba?
In Sumba, the Muslim migrant population is mainly located in Wengapu. So Wengapu has been the major port there for hundreds of centuries, or not hundreds of years, for many centuries. And I have in my dissertation, the 1890 census, I believe, the 1890 census, a majority of Wengapu would have been Muslim if it were not for Savonese Christians who were brought over by the king to work as protection for him. And so Wengapu continues to be the primary Sumbanese population of Muslims. It's where you have the most mosques. It's where you have the most Muslims. It's where you have the most religious schools. Outside of that, you'd have Mamboro, Waikububak, and Waikelo. Mamboro and Waikelo are both port cities, which have, again, Muslim populations which have lived there for centuries.
Okay, thank you for that. And how about the other participants? Maybe you want to ask something
Hello.
about Timor, or you can just turn
Hello.
on you.
Go ahead. I think we hear someone.
Oh yeah, Dolphus.
Can okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Mike. Your research is very interesting, and I think because I'm from NTT, especially from Manggarai, now I think your research is more closely with my research topic on my thesis, and my research topic is about understanding the minority students in Jogja from the Christian youth in and I think that is very very close to your to your research. And my question is in social interaction between let's say the majority and minority, is the more influential motivation in social interaction is religious motivation or ethnic motivation beside the economic motivation.
Well, in terms of social
Can you get
interaction,
the
yeah,
point?
I think I got it. And if I answer another question, you can ask your question again. I think in terms of the migrants, the social interaction between migrants in the rural areas or in the maybe earlier periods of Muslim migration to NTT was primarily based on religious lines. And so you connected to other Muslim migrants on account of your faith. Now, as the communities grow, you have the opportunity of saying, okay, I'm Javanese, I want to connect to other Javanese, or I'm Bugis, so I want to connect to other Bugis. And so somewhere in Kupang, for instance, you don't really have this in other places in NTT or in my research areas. But in Kupang, for instance, you'll have like, you have a, I think it's Kontak Kerukunan Jawa, like K2S, like it's a group of Javanese migrants, and they identify not as Muslim, but based on their Javanese ethnicity. And so you've got people that, of course, it's predominantly Muslim, but you've got Christians and others that are joining based on Javanese ethnicity. And then you've got other groups, which, you know, for instance, you have a group of people from Padang. And although they're basing their socialization on their ethnic or origin, it's also connected with religion. And so that's one of the things that is kind of hard to say to some extent in terms of how do these groups socialize once you start seeing bigger communities develop, is because geographic space in Indonesia is often connected with religious identity. And so if somebody tells me they're Balinese, I'm going to expect them to be Hindu. If somebody tells me they're from NTT, even though there's a 10% chance they're Muslim, I'm going to just assume that they're Protestant or Catholic. Somebody tells me they're Chinese, for instance, I might assume they're Christian. And so these lines blur in Indonesia. But going back to the original question, I think primarily at first, there's socialization based on religious identity. And then as the opportunity grows, it becomes socialization based on ethnic identity, ethnic origin, but still heavily connected to religious identity. I put my email in the chat, so if anyone wants to follow up with me, I'll be back in Indonesia in a couple months.
Okay, thank you very much. Your invitation. Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
until then, you have questions, you want some advice, you want me to check over something, just send me an email.
Okay, thank you, Adolfo Sentosa. How about other participants? Do you have any questions? How about what do you think about the need for interreligious literacy? Do you think like do we need renew it because of this adaptation for migration, or is it just I don't know. I mean,
Yeah, so ICRS has done a lot of work recently on Penulo Agama and helping them to better understand interreligious literacy and develop the ability to not only understand it, but to promote it in their work. I'd also be for promoting this in the national curriculum. And I think a lot of activists and a lot of scholars are saying this as well. Indonesia is very good about normative religious education. Muslims learn about Islam, Hindus learn about Hinduism, but we very rarely do we learn about other faiths. We may learn about Pancasila, we may learn about Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, we may learn all these things, but we don't learn the basics. And so I think the basics are very important in the story of these migrants in Sumba and Timor. The basics of, for instance, in Timor, there was a conflict, a minor conflict. There was a person selling, he had a little kaki lima and he was selling babi in front of the mosque. Well, that's perhaps not the best place to place your kaki lima. And so things like this, small practical examples, small basic knowledge of another religion and what is right and wrong, what is acceptable and haram, for instance, can go a long way to helping people not make mistakes which offend. And it can also help people make mistakes or help people see things maybe in a different light. Yeah, I mean, it's something that is needed not only in the national curriculum, but all the way up through the citizenry. So I don't know if it's whether it's TV education, I don't know whether it's through community education, but here's one of the situations that was really disheartening in Sumba. In Sumba, there was an issue with the migrants in the local community, and they just couldn't understand why Muslims couldn't eat certain things. And the head of the FKUB came in during this meeting, and this is the head of the FKUB who's in charge of promoting interreligious harmony in Sumba. And he said, I don't get it. Why can't you Muslims eat? And it's just because he did not know about halal and haram. He didn't know the dietary restrictions of Muslims. And so the MOE had to come in and teach them. And if this is a problem at the level of FKUB, then this is the problem at the level of Christian leaders and Muslim religious leaders. It's going to be a problem at the grassroots, the lower level, the level of the common people. And so there needs to be a drastic changing of how we educate people about these different faiths if they're going to live together in harmony.
Yeah, that's true. And this is from Bapak Zain. You started your presentation with the US context. What findings of your research in NTT are most relevant for your US context?
Yeah, I think a lot of my findings have relevance, at least at the interpersonal level. As I tend, when I speak in churches in the US, I'm the go-to expert on Islam. I'm the go-to expert on migration. I'm the go-to expert on Muslim migrants. And so, while I don't know everything. I know a little bit more than some other people. And for instance, this week, I shared with a church about Ramadan, about the beginning of Ramadan. And here where I am right now, there are probably only a few hundred Muslims in this city. But out of a few hundred, that means somebody has a classmate, somebody has a friend, somebody has a colleague at work that is Muslim. If they just have a little bit of knowledge of what Ramadan is, what the expectations of dietary requirements are, how they can bless their Muslim neighbor by offering them food, sharing a meal, giving a small gift for Eid. This is a way of showing respect and being a good neighbor. And as a Christian, we're called to, of course, love our neighbors, but also, I think this is important to migration, we're called to love foreigners as ourselves. We're called to love foreigners as part of our own community. And that's something that I think a lot of Americans miss in what you hear of US policy on migration. Here we call ourselves a Christian nation, but at the same time, we have different ideas when it comes to migration. We have very ethnocentric, racist, prejudiced ideas when it comes to migration. And so helping churches to better understand the struggles, the adaptations, the needs of migrants, I think can better help them meet the needs of migrants. And that's not necessarily for the purposes of conversion, that's just for the purposes of being a good neighbor, providing stability to communities. In my community, for instance, we have as I said, a large South Asian population. And because it kind of grew slowly over time, nobody thought, hey, we need to do some cultural literacy programs on understanding South Asians, on understanding Hinduism, on understanding Islam. And only now, after 20 years of migration, are these conflicts rising and the tensions rising to the surface, and our churches and other religious groups and civic groups are realizing, okay, we need to better understand migration. We need to better understand how to manage this. And so, like I said, simple religious literacy, simple cultural literacy examples that I can provide are the best things I bring to my community from this dissertation.
Okay. How about that, Pak Zain?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in every country we will have kind of a difficulty in the issue of migration, because the people needs to adapt to new environment, and also the people. Okay. Okay, Mas Eric.
Okay, thank you, Dita. Hello, Mike. Thank you very much for your presentation. And I think it is very nice to hear you again after last time I hear your presentation on your cross defense. And I think it's still very, very important and have a very good finding from your research in Sumba. And I have maybe just a short question that I think you know that NTT is ever awarded as the most tolerant province in Indonesia. And maybe I also from NTT, from Manggarai. And in your opinion, from your finding in Sumba while during your research, how do you think about this award? Is it still relevant, or you find something else from your research?
Yeah, it's very relevant. I responded to Dita earlier about how people come to their beliefs about NTT and the people of NTT, and they have these stereotypes and these generalizations that they're loud, that they're rude, they're quick to anger, But as these migrants enter into NTT, they realize, no, it's not that they're rude. It's not that they're loud. It's not that they're quick to anger. It's just they have a different culture. And my study found that nearly every single migrant I talked to said NTT, Sumba Timor are far more tolerant than their sending societies. So that includes Sumatra, that includes Sulawesi, that includes Java, Lombok, Sumbawa. They find acceptance as Muslims in these Christian majorities that they say that Christians would not find in Bima, Christians would not find in Lombok. And so I do think that status of the most tolerant in Indonesia, at least from my study, is confirmed. And that's a good thing for me. I don't think if you asked people about my state in America, we would not be the most tolerant state. And that is very disappointing. So when I came to Sumba, I was very happy to see that Christians were doing what they were supposed to do, that they were loving their neighbors. I think that's something we can learn from Sumba, we can learn from Timor. But even though they might be the best, there's of course still work to be done. There's still opportunities for learning, and there's still opportunities for improving that tolerance.
Okay, thank you. There will be 2 questions for you in the chat box. From Shakil Ahmad, for NTT context, besides Sumba and Timor, do you have any findings toward other islands like Flores and Adunara? Do the migrants have any traces there? And the second one is from Krisharyanto Umbu. May you explore more the issue of land rights mentioned in your last slide? Thank you.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I limited my research to Sumba and Timor. I've never been to Flores. The only time I've tried to go to Flores, there was the ship could not travel because of the waves were too high. And so I had to fly home from Kupang, and I was very sad. But I plan to continue this research across Indonesia. Not only do I want to study other Christian and Catholic majority islands, I do want to study how Christians are experiencing moving, for instance, to Java, how Christians are experiencing, life in Aceh. I think it's important that this research become reciprocal and studying both sides of the issue. And not only studying the migrants, but how host communities are receiving. I just ran out of time. I couldn't really delve into how the Sumbanese community thinks about these Muslim migrant neighbors that they have. And so that's something that needs to be studied. But unfortunately, Flores, not yet. More about land rights. Land rights have been an issue in Indonesia since the Dutch were still colonizing Indonesia. And land rights is specifically an issue with indigenous groups even now. When I first arrived to Sumba, the very first day I arrived in Sumba, 2 people wanted to sell me land. I'm Wayana, I can't buy land. And as I've come to know Sumba more over these last 5 years of visiting Sumba, I've seen the tensions that have arisen because Javanese investors, foreign investors have come and they've bought up land. When I was doing my research in Waikabubak, there was a riot in Lamboya and somebody was shot. And the reason for this riot was because the first party had sold land to a second party. The second party, who was supposed to keep it among Sumbanese people, sold it to a Javanese investor. And that caused conflict. As I mentioned, the Loli tribe in Waikabubak, they sold a lot of their land to migrants who came from Java, who had, more significant means, more of an ability to buy the land. And now these people are without land. They've spent all the money that they made on the land, and now they're basically landless. And that is going to become a big problem in the future. Land will continue to be a problem in every country of the world. And I think it's important that Indonesia thinks about this internal migration, thinks about the disparities of income between the islands and different people groups, and protects places like NTT from the exploitation of richer peoples, of foreign investors and things like this. I know just from living in Jogja, the land prices in my area have gone up 400% in the last 7 years, because people from Jakarta, they retire and they buy land in Jogja. Bali, of course, they know it as well. People expect me as an American to be wealthy. I could never afford to buy land in Jogja, and so I will rent until I move back to the U.S. Because land is just too expensive. And so we need to protect these indigenous groups. We need to protect local communities by having some better policies in place for who can buy land and how the land can be used.
So thank you. We still have 4 more minutes. Okay, Freddy Torang, please.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you hear my voice here?
Yes.
Okay, because I thought I don't have enough time. Well, I think because of unstable connection in here, I missed some explanation from you, Mike. Can you explain again, or can you elaborate in the part of adaptation? You said, if I'm not mistaken, you said the lack of leadership or something, the leadership of religious leaders, if I'm not mistaken, or we can say not good enough of the leadership of the religious leaders in your explanation. Can you elaborate more specifically or re-mention again, because I lost some explanation from you, what exactly you mean as the leadership of the religious leader is not good? Thank you so much. That's all.
And maybe if you heard me say the religious leadership is not good, that's perhaps incorrect. What I would say is, in terms of helping migrants to adapt, none of the migrants shared with me that their religious communities were specifically teaching them how to adapt to the local culture. So I would envision, for instance, the Muslim community offering courses for new migrants, for instance, on local customs, offering theological training on how to deal with the interaction of Christianity and Islam. Things that we do in the American church, we try to help people cope with changing in culture. And so migrants, they're changing culture faster than just normal culture is changing. And so I think that's an opportunity. I think it's a missed opportunity that neither the Christian church or the mosque is taking to help migrants and the host communities adapt to life in this new normal. The new normal being that Muslims are living in a Christian majority environment. They're having to deal with Christians every day. They don't know the cultures of Sumba and Timor. And Christians are living with Muslims as neighbors, and they don't know the cultures of these newcomers. They don't know the dietary laws. They don't know the religious requirements. And so I think that's not only important for the government to provide education, I think it's important that faith groups also do this work as well.
Okay, thank you.
And, maybe do you have any closing statements for this forum?
I'll just say this. As I look around, as I've listened to the people that have asked questions, we're all migrants in different places, especially in Jogja. We all have an opportunity to learn from one another. And it's important that especially for us, CRCS, ICRS, this is why we're here, for the work of religious knowledge, for the work of cultural awareness, for promoting interfaith tolerance. Migration is something that is only going to continue. There's more migrants in the world today than there has ever been. Even though there's been mass migrations of people throughout history, there are more migrations now. And so look at the migrant living next to you and see what you can do to help them to be part of the community. See what you can do to welcome them and see what you can learn from them. That's all.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike, for this presentation. And I think I want to conclude your presentation. I think the first one is that as you speak, that even though the migrants have any kind of difficulty to adapt into the new environment, people in Sumba and Timor, but eventually they will increase themselves in or they will adapt themselves into this kind of environment, because the environment in itself will change